When it comes to increasing your squat, bench and deadlift, specificity isn't always key.
What?
Transferences. Less specific variations may be useful to bring out weaknesses and give you more return on investment than the competition lifts itself. But here's the catch. You can't deviate too far from competition specificity because you'll lose important adaptations, including the skill itself. So the big question is, do you need specificity year round? And if so, how much do you need? So if you're new here, my name is Nguyen Chung and I've been coaching powerlifting for over a decade. Now, before we get into this debate, we need to clearly understand what specificity is. Now, specificity is a core training principle which states that a powerlifter's training should replicate to some degree the demands of the competition lifts. It's predicated on a said principle, which stands for specific adaptations on imposed demands, which makes sense. There are specific changes that happen when you do back squats compared to when doing a front squat or leg press. But here's the thing. Specificity can also refer to the training dose, i.e. the volume, intensity, etc., and also the movement itself, i.e. the exercise selection and the variations used. I think ultimately, specificity is best conceptualized as a continuum of specificity and variability. The important thing to remember is that training specificity is not binary. Exercises, intensity, and stimuli can fall anywhere between highly specific and highly general. And on the specific end of the spectrum, which has a finite end, is basically performing a 1 rep max of the competition lifts in competition equipment. Interestingly, what's characterized by the variability end of that spectrum is an indefinite end. Technically, it does not have a defined end, as what you can do can be so many degrees removed from competition specificity. Fundamentally, variability is open-ended. Another thing that a lot of people often miss is that when looking at a training program as a whole, specificity isn't just about how closely the exercises replicate the competition lifts. It's also how narrow or focused the overall movement selection is as well. And the more limited the range of movements, the higher the specificity. And the broader the variety, the greater the variability. So let's dive deeper into the specificity of the movement and dose. So going back to specificity of movement, it's obviously how much the movement replicates the competition task, as we mentioned before. Absolute specificity is obviously doing your competition lifts with your competition kit with maximal effort intent. And that's the key thing. But here's the thing that most people don't realize. Deviating from specificity isn't just changing the movement itself. This is a change in kinematics. In sports science, kinematics describes the motion without necessarily referencing the forces. So think a movement that looks different. You can also change the effort of the repetition execution as well. This is kinetics. Now, kinetics describes the motions with reference to the forces. Think tempo, long pauses, pauses at mid-range, etc. So you can also maintain movement specificity but have variations in kinetics, such as pause squats or tempo squats. But when it comes to the specificity of dose, this refers to how much the volume and intensity replicates that of competition performance. So higher specificity of dose means moving towards prescriptions towards lower reps and higher absolute intensity and a closer proximity to failure. On the surface, it seems like it is completely separate from movement, but here's the interesting part. Specificity of movement and dose can be somewhat interconnected, and here's how. Let's say you have a back squat on one days. One of the goals that you have is to maintain balance and even pressure through the lift. This is so that you can maximize vertical force production. The higher the percentage that you lift in this variation, the higher the proportion of the bar weight relative to the body weight. This means that how you organize your posture and positioning around a bar can vary slightly. My theory is that this is the reason why relative muscle activation between muscle groups can potentially vary as you work up to higher percentages. And so that is why the specificity of dose can actually influence the movement and how you coordinate the movement in the exercise itself. So how important is specificity? Now, specificity tells you the nature of the task. It doesn't tell you its value relative to the individual without considering the context of that individual. But here's the problem. You cannot assume that specificity is linearly and directly correlated with transference to an athlete progress of performance. A really good analogy is like driving a car from one destination to another. Sometimes the most efficient path to another place isn't necessarily the most geographically direct route, because sometimes in life you get traffic. In this case, sometimes the faster route is occasionally a less direct route, even though it may on surface seem like it will take longer. So let's take a really simplified example. Let's say someone has a squat where the hips rise more than the shoulders when they come out of the hole. You may find that a variation like a high bar squat would transfer more to a better progress than a competition squat itself. So let's talk about specificity and how much of it is actually useful in the off season. So in this case, when I say off season, I just mean the training before the peak and taper. Now, first off, we do need enough specificity of movement. And that just means that the lifter needs to practice the actual comp lifts squat, bench, and dead enough that the skill doesn't get lost or start to degrade. You don't want to come back to a comp prep after weeks and months of volume training and feel like you've forgotten how to set up under a bar. But there's another angle here too. You also want sufficient specificity so that your top end performance can still be tracked, or at very least be loosely monitored. For example, tracking the estimated 1 rep max of triples or fours is going to be way more reliable than tracking the estimated 1 rep maxes of sets of 8s, 9s or 10s. One important thing to note is that this can also vary from lifter to lifter and lift to lift as well. If everything's too far removed from competition lift, then you could lose that feedback loop. You can't really tell if you're actually getting stronger or improving technically in a way that matters on a platform. Now, beyond the movement itself, there's also specificity of dose, meaning things like intensity, volume, and how hard you're pushing. We need enough specificity of dose to avoid losing that threshold intensity, that certain gear that you need to hit when trying to move heavy weight. This is exactly why hypertrophy blocks without exposure to enough top end intensity, whilst useful, aren't always the best tool depending on the individual scenario. Sure, you might increase your performance on maybe your volume sets. Maybe you're smashing those 4 sets of 10s at higher loads than ever, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will translate well to your top end strength. You might come back to the singles and doubles and be stuck at the same number compared to before. As a rule of thumb, it's always useful to maintain exposure to at least around 83% for lower body lifts and 85% for upper body lifts. But here's the other side of the coin, and this is where nuance comes in. If you make the dose too specific, in other words, you're hammering that peak intensity too often or pushing too much volume into those 90% plus range, you can actually start to compromise the performance of the volume work. And that volume work is what really drives that progressive overload and long-term progress. So if you're constantly overreaching with that top end set or just dumping too much of your training economy into the competition specific intensity, you can end up shooting yourself in the foot. And essentially you're trying to chase specificity, but you lose the engine that was pushing you forward in the first place. So then let's talk about specificity in the competition season. So it's common to gradually move towards specificity when going into the competition season, i.e. in the peak and taper, but only if what was done prior is not sufficiently preparing the athlete enough for competition performance. The thing that coaches are doing at any given point in time is to figure out what to give lifters at every point. Sometimes specificity doesn't actually increase in a linear fashion when going towards competition season. Now, this may be more relevant to higher level powerlifters, and by higher level powerlifters, I generally mean those with higher training ages. And through a higher training age, there would be a journey of progressive overload. This means that the lifter's threshold need of training dose just to maintain their current strength levels would have increased considerably since. Adaptations are fundamentally transient. That means that they can go away. And the changes that your body makes in response to your training or stress are temporary and can fade over time if the stimulus is removed. When it comes to transition from the off-season training to competition prep, the needle on the dial of specificity doesn't always need to change depending on the nature of the prior training. If the previous training has sufficient exposure to specificity, then the program might not necessarily need to go more specific. If all of the non-specific aspects of the program help the lifter actually get stronger, then that is of value to the lifter. And at the same time, if there is enough exposure to that top end intensity, then overall, the training doesn't necessarily need to get more specific when going into the competition prep. So when going into the peak and tapers, programming doesn't need to change that drastically towards the end. This means that you shouldn't necessarily just suddenly make some of the exercises more specific. You shouldn't suddenly start to cut down some of the rep ranges and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, as the needs of the athlete changes due to adapting to the training being provided, the needs can also change as well. And so the better solutions for the athlete can also change. In practice, that looks like fluctuations in choices of exercise selection, which emerges as the potential change in varying levels of specificity and not in any apparent direction. So I hope you guys found this video useful. And as always, please click like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.